We're discussing how the family court system failed 4-year-old Keira, who was murdered by her abusive father. We're talking to Jennifer and Philip, Keira's mother and stepfather. Now, Jennifer, the judge labeled your divorce as high conflict, but there's obviously a difference between a toxic or high conflict divorce and a divorce where one party has a long and established pattern of abuse. So what can you tell me about that difference, and how well do you think that difference is understood by judges and even by the public?
Well, the first thing I'll say is that the term high conflict does an immense disservice to domestic violence victims, and it's an extremely dangerous term, right? The term high conflict would denote that both parties are involved in perpetuating the conflict, whereas a domestic violence case is distinctly different. You have a clear pattern of behavior with one perpetrator perpetuating the conflict, trying to get his claws into the other, who's the victim, who may be trying to protect the child from the harm given the perpetrator's behavior. So the two must be distinguished from one another. And when this doesn't happen in the courts, we lump, these bitter splits in with the truly dangerous ones. And the end result is that children like my daughter are killed.
Philip, same question to you. How do we distinguish between high conflict and domestic abuse? And do you think there's been a misunderstanding in the courts?
There has been a huge misunderstanding, which is why the education is so important. Because when you label something high conflict instead of abuse, a few things happen. First of all, the perpetrators love it because there's now no accountability for their actions, so they just continue it. And the court, in some regards, becomes an unwitting enabler for that to continue. And then the other problem is that if you're looking at the case through the wrong lens, then the orders and directions that a judge is going to give and make are completely wrong. You're going to give a completely different set of directions to somebody who's abused than two people who simply don't get along. And then if you're looking at it through the wrong lens again, then you may fail to understand trauma responses of an abuse victim, where they could come off as overly protective. But if you don't understand that they're legitimately being protective because they are victims of abuse, then you may make the wrong orders, and it happens all the time, and it's wrong.
Jennifer, one of the things that stands out to me so starkly about your case is that Philip, your husband, is a family lawyer. So of anyone, I would think, navigating the system, it was such a clear-cut case. In your case, you have this kind of in-house edge, and the system still failed you. So what hope is there in the current system for, regular abuse victims who don't have, their own family lawyer who they're married to, who don't have the resources to fight tooth and nail for their children?
I mean, my case really highlights the abject failures of the family court system for victims of violence and for children. I mean, fortunately, we did have the resources. And as you say, my husband understood the system, and yet still Keira was failed. In many, many cases, there are further barriers to access to justice. And, in my case, for example, when you have the perpetrator abduct, our daughter, I'm able to afford to pay for a lawyer to have her returned to my care. But you can only imagine the suffering of children when, the resources are more of an issue, and it's hugely unfair. And so, if we still couldn't protect Keira in this situation, one can only imagine all of the other failures for children in many other cases. And it's very wrong.
Philip, if there's anything you want to add to that.
Yeah, I think, the more we relay the story to the public, and everyone is just so shocked about this obvious failure. We weren't silent in the court. It's not like we stood there and, with our heads buried in the sand. We relayed this information to the court, to Jewish Family and Child Services, and it was ignored or minimized or whatever. And I think the highlight that I would, stress is our case was so extreme, and it still failed. And just as kind of Jennifer's point, if it's failing us, imagine what it's doing to cases who are less extreme, but still serious just the same. Maybe the abuse won't end up in murder, but there's still abuse going on, and it's clearly being ignored.
And of course, there was alleged failure here. You're alleging a failure by Jewish Community Family or Jewish Children Family Services as well. And in the next episode, we're going to be discussing your lawsuit against them for the failures that they had in their investigation and their failures that they had to protect your daughter, Keira.